Eun Seong-gon had walked through interrogation rooms where the strongest men turned to glass and shattered. He had sat at tables where a flick of his lighter decided which shipping docks in Incheon would burn that night. Nothing surprised him. Nothing moved him. And in 34 years of running the Eun syndicate, nothing had ever made him stop breathing. Until tonight. He stormed into his mother's private conservatory, ready to demand why his accounts were flagged, but the words died in his throat. He heard a sound that didn't belong in a house built on silence and steel. It was the soft, rhythmic hum of a prenatal monitor. And there, standing in the center of the room, bathed in the soft glow of the medical equipment, was the ghost he thought he had erased. Fatima Sekinat Isreal. The woman he had personally fired, blacklisted, and ordered to vanish 6 months ago. But look at the screen with me. 6 months. He threw her out of his life 6 months ago like she was a security risk. But Fatima isn't a ghost, and she isn't hiding. She is standing there with her hand over an unmistakable, heavy bump, carrying the Eun bloodline he was told didn't exist. But here is what truly shattered his iron resolve. More than the pregnancy, more than the fact that she was standing on his soil again. His mother, the formidable matriarch of the Eun family, stood beside the maid, her hand resting protectively on Fatima's shoulder. She wasn't standing behind her son. She was standing in his way. When Seong-gon opened his mouth to demand an explanation, his mother's voice hit the room like a death sentence. "You erased her to save your throne," she said, her eyes colder than his own. "So I hid your future to save my grandchild. If you crave stories where a ruthless king is brought to his knees by the very heart he tried to break, stay with me. Because what Eun Seong-gon is about to realize is that his empire is nothing but a hollow house of cards, and the only woman who can save it is the one he tried to destroy. But first, we have to rewind. Because Fatima didn't just survive the streets of Seoul alone. Someone betrayed Seong-gon from inside his own inner circle, and the reason why is more lethal than any bullet. The rain in Seoul that night didn't just fall. It hammered against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse like 1,000 frantic heartbeats, desperate to get inside. But inside, the air was as sterile and cold as a tomb. Eun Seong-gon stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the city lights. He didn't look like a man in love. He looked like a king preparing to sign a death warrant. Fatima stood in the center of the vast, minimalist living room, her small suitcase sitting like an insult at her feet. She still wore her modest maid's uniform, the charcoal fabric pressed and neat, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her chest. For 2 years, she had been the ghost in this house, the one who knew exactly how he liked his tea, which nightmares kept him awake, and where the scars from his childhood ended and the dragon tattoos began. "Seong-gon," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast space. "Look at me." He didn't move. His reflection in the glass was sharp, the high cheekbones, the jawline set in stone, the black silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the tail of a dragon creeping up his neck. To the world, he was the untouchable heir to the Eun syndicate. To her, he was the man who had held her hand in the dark and promised that her heritage and her status didn't matter in his world. He had lied. "The board has seen the photos, Fatima," he finally said. His voice was devoid of the warmth they had shared only 48 hours prior. It was the voice he used when ordering a rival's territory to be seized. "They see a foreign maid. They see a distraction. They see a hole in my armor that our enemies can exploit." "I am not a distraction," she said, her deep brown skin glowing under the harsh LED lights as she took a step toward him. "I am the woman who stayed when you were bleeding out on this very floor last winter. I am the only person in this city who doesn't want anything from you but your time." Seong-gon finally turned, and for a split second, the mask slipped. His eyes were shattered, vibrating with a conflict he refused to name. But then, he thought of the security summary Director Shin had placed on his desk that morning, the fake reports of Fatima meeting with rival informants, the staged photos of her stealing from the family safe. He had been played by his own advisors, led to believe that his heart was a weapon being used against his throne. "You are a liability," he snapped, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "In my world, liabilities are erased. I should have known better than to think a girl like you could survive the weight of my name. Fatima flinched as if he had physically struck her. The girl like you stung more than the liability. He was reducing her to her skin, her job, and her lack of a pedigree. She realized then that he wasn't just firing a maid. He was trying to kill the part of himself that felt human. You're a coward, Seong-gon, she said, her voice regaining a terrifying, quiet dignity. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She reached down and gripped the handle of her suitcase. You're so afraid of losing a throne made of blood that you're throwing away the only thing that's actually yours. Get out, he commanded, turning back to the window. A car is waiting to take you to the airport. Your accounts have been closed. Your visa sponsorship is revoked. By tomorrow morning, Fatima, you will not exist in this country. He didn't see her hand instinctively go to her stomach. It was a fleeting, subconscious gesture, a protective press against a secret that had only been confirmed that morning. She had come to him tonight to tell him that the Eun bloodline was continuing, that they were no longer just a distraction, but a family. But as she looked at his cold, broad back, she realized the man she loved had already been replaced by the monster the syndicate demanded he be. If she told him now, he wouldn't see a child. He would see another liability to be managed or deleted. I'm going, she said, her voice steady even as her heart broke into a million jagged pieces. But remember this night, Seong-gon. Remember the night you chose a chair in a boardroom over the person who loved you. She walked toward the door, the click of her sensible shoes echoing against the marble. Seong-gon listened to every step, his hands clenched into fists so tight the dragon tattoos on his knuckles turned white. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to roar at her to stay. But the shadow of his father and the weight of the syndicate held his feet in place. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, the penthouse felt suddenly, violently empty. Outside, the rain had turned into a deluge. Fatima didn't get into the black sedan waiting at the curb. She knew that car wouldn't take her to an airport. It would take her to a place where she would truly be erased. Instead, she turned toward the service entrance and disappeared into the gray veil of the Seoul midnight. She had no money, no legal status, and no home. She was a woman carrying a prince in a kingdom that had just declared her an enemy. But as she walked into the cold, biting wind, her chin remained high. Seong-gon thought he had deleted her, but Fatima Sekinat Isreal was about to show the Eun family that some things, and some people, are impossible to erase. Back in the penthouse, Seong-gon watched a lone figure disappear into the dark on the street below. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself his empire was safe. He didn't know that in 9 months, he would be standing in his mother's house, begging for a single look from the woman he had just cast into the storm. He didn't know that tonight. He hadn't saved his future. He had just thrown it away. For 3 months, the silence in the Eun estate was heavier than any shout. Madame Kang Hwoyong, the matriarch whose soft silk robes hid a heart of tempered steel, watched her son from across long, mahogany dinner tables. She saw the way Seong-gon's eyes had turned into chips of obsidian, cold, lifeless, and devoid of the spark that had once made him human. He had cleaned his house, but in doing so, he had turned his home into a mausoleum. Madame Kang was not a woman who moved on impulse. She was a woman who moved on intuition. She had watched Fatima for 2 years. She had seen the girl's quiet strength and the way her presence calmed the dragon in Seong-gon's blood. When her son announced that the maid had been dismissed for security breaches, the matriarch hadn't argued. She had simply waited until Seong-gon left for an overseas merger. Then she had descended into the surveillance wing of the estate. She didn't look at the edited reports Director Shin had provided. Instead, she looked at the raw, deleted footage from the service entrance on that rainy midnight. She saw Fatima walking away, not toward the airport sedan, but into the dark, clutching her stomach with a protective desperation that only one mother can recognize in another. It was a gesture Madame Kang herself had made 35 years ago when the syndicate was crumbling and Seong-gon was nothing but a heartbeat beneath her ribs. The search began in the shadows. Madame Kang didn't use the syndicate's trackers. She used her own private network of old sisters, the retired housekeepers and displaced women who saw everything and said nothing. For weeks, the trail was cold. Fatima had been thorough. She had vanished into the dense, multi-ethnic districts of Itaewon, living in the cracks of a city that was designed to ignore her. It was a small clinic on the outskirts of the city that finally provided the answer. Eun Sekinat Isreal had checked in under a false name, paying in crumpled bills for a prenatal screening she couldn't afford. When the matriarch's lead investigator brought her the grainy ultrasound photo tucked inside a medical folder, the air in the room seemed to vanish. There, in the black and white static of the image, was the unmistakable curve of a spine, a new Eun, growing in the womb of a woman the family had tried to destroy. Madame Kong didn't hesitate. She didn't call her son. She knew that if the syndicate's board found out, they would see the child as a bastard or a tool for leverage. She went herself. The villa where she found Fatima was a crumbling walk-up apartment, smelling of damp wood and spicy stews. When the door opened, Fatima didn't scream or beg. She stood there, her deep brown skin pale from exhaustion, her modest maid's uniform replaced by a loose, oversized sweater. Her eyes, once full of warmth for the Eun family, were now guarded by a wall of ice. "I have nothing left to give you," Fatima said, her voice a low, vibrating warning. "He took everything. My job, my status, my name. Leave me the child." Madame Kong stepped into the small, cramped room, her handmade leather heels clicking on the linoleum. She looked at the single bed, the stacks of books on Korean law Fatima was studying to find a way to stay, and the small bowl of fruit on the table, the only luxury in the room. "My son is a fool, Fatima," Madame Kong said, her voice softening in a way it never did for her own flesh and blood. "He thinks power is about what you can cut away. He has forgotten that real power is what you grow." She reached out, her rings catching the dim light of the apartment, and placed a hand on Fatima's arm. "I didn't come here to take him. I came to hide you. Not from the police, and not from the world, but from the version of Seong-gon that believes he is a monster." For the first time since that rainy night, Fatima's composure broke. A single tear tracked down her cheek, but she didn't lower her head. "He erased me, madam. He told me I didn't exist." "Then we shall let him believe his lie for a little longer," the matriarch replied, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, protective light. "While he plays at being a king in his empty castle, we will build a fortress for the heir. You are not a maid anymore, Fatima. You are the vessel of my family's future. And in this country, no one is more powerful than a grandmother with a secret." That afternoon, a medical villa in the secluded hills of Gapyeong, an estate Seong-gon hadn't visited in a decade, was quietly staffed with private nurses bound by lifelong non-disclosure agreements. As Fatima was moved into the sun-drenched rooms, Madame Kong sat in the back of her black limousine, watching the city lights flicker by. She looked at her phone, at a missed call from Seong-gon. She didn't return it. For months, she would play the role of the grieving mother, the disappointed matriarch, and the silent observer. She would watch her son's soul wither from the guilt he refused to acknowledge, waiting for the exact moment the fruit was ripe. She would let him feel the weight of his erasure until it nearly crushed him. Only then, when he was truly broken, would she show him the light she had been keeping in the dark. The Eun bloodline was not dead. It was merely waiting for a father who was worthy of the name. And as Madame Kong felt the first kick of the child through Fatima's belly later that week, she knew the war for the Eun syndicate was just beginning, and this time, the women would be the ones to win it. The heavy scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain clung to the air in Seong-gon's private study, but the atmosphere was poisoned by something far more acidic: doubt. For 3 months, Seong-gon had operated like a machine, his movements precise, his heart a cauterized wound. He had convinced himself that by removing Fatima, he had cut out a cancer that threatened the Eun syndicate. He had repeated the words security risk until they felt like a mantra, a shield against the hollow ache that echoed in the penthouse every time he saw her empty tea service or the way the light hit the hallway where she used to stand. But tonight, the shield cracked. It started with a discrepancy in the quarterly security audit, a minor ghost in the machine. A digital footprint left by director Shin's private server had bled into the syndicate's main ledger. Seong-gon, a man who survived by noticing the tremble in a liar's hand, couldn't ignore the smudge on the record. He sat behind his desk, the dragon tattoos on his hands flexed as he bypassed the encryption layers he had trusted Shin to build. As the files unspooled across his monitors, the world Seong-gon had built on logic began to liquefy. He found the folder marked Project Blackthorn. Inside were the original high-resolution photos of the infidelity that had broken his resolve 6 months ago. In the version Shin had shown him, Fatima was seen entering a hotel room with a known informant for the rival Kong family. Seong-gon leaned closer to the screen, his breath hitching. In the unedited raw files, the timestamp was different. The informant was a digital composite, his face stitched onto the body of a delivery courier. More devastatingly, the wide-angle shot showed Fatima wasn't entering a hotel room. She was entering a pharmacy to buy prenatal vitamins. The mouse clicked again, his finger trembling. Next came the theft reports. Shin had presented bank statements showing Fatima funneling syndicate funds into an offshore account. Seong-gon pulled the actual bank logs. The money had never moved toward Fatima. It had been looped through a shell company owned by director Shin's brother, then laundered back into a political slush fund. Fatima hadn't stolen a single one. She hadn't betrayed a single secret. Seong-gon stood up so abruptly his heavy velvet chair crashed against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. He felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. He looked at the desk where he had signed the deportation and erasure papers, the very spot where he had traded the only woman who ever loved him for a pile of fabricated lies. Shin, he whispered, the name tasting like ash. He realized then the depth of the trap. His advisors hadn't just wanted Fatima gone. They wanted him isolated. They knew that as long as Fatima was by his side, Seong-gon had something to live for beyond the throne. She was his tether to humanity, and by severing it, they had made him a king who was easier to manipulate, a king who was drowning in his own bitterness. He pulled up the security threat summary one last time. He saw the red stamps, the forged signatures of internal auditors, and the psychological profile Shin had drafted, calling Fatima a honey trap operative. Seong-gon's hand swept across the desk in a blind, white-hot rage, sending a crystal decanter shattering against the wall. The amber liquid bled down the wallpaper like an open vein. He had prided himself on being the smartest man in the room, the wolf who saw through every sheep's clothing. Yet, he had been the easiest mark of all because he had been willing to believe the worst of the person who gave him the best of herself. He remembered the way she had looked at him that last night, the quiet, devastated dignity in her eyes when she called him a coward. She had been right. He was so terrified of his own vulnerability that he had let a handful of doctored papers override 2 years of shared breaths and whispered promises. He had used his power to erase an innocent woman because it was easier than admitting he couldn't survive without her. I fired her for being a thief, he choked out to the empty room, his voice cracking for the first time in a decade. And I was the one who stole everything. He went back to the computer, his eyes burning as he searched for the deportation tracking number. He needed to find her. He would spend every billion in the Eun treasury to bring her back. But as the screen loaded the final status of the erasure protocol, his heart stopped. Target, Fatima Sekinat Isreal. Status, disappeared. Location, unknown. The system Shin had built to protect the syndicate had worked too well. By Seong-gon's own order, Fatima had been wiped from every official database, every flight manifest, and every city camera. He had made her a ghost, and now, he was haunted by a trail that ended in a vacuum. He slumped back against the desk, his head in his hands. The dragon tattoos on his neck felt like they were strangling him. He was the most powerful man in Seoul, sitting in a fortress of glass and steel, surrounded by men who had tricked him into destroying his own soul. He had no lead, no hope, and no way to say he was sorry. He didn't know yet that his mother was miles away, watching a monitor that showed a much different reality. He didn't know that while he sat in the wreckage of his lies, the liability he had discarded was currently sleeping in a bed he had paid for, carrying the heartbeat that would either save him or finish the job of destroying him. Seong-gon closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the great boss of the Eun syndicate wept, not for his empire, but for the maid who had been the only truth in a world built on paper lies. The safe house in Gapyeong was a fortress of cedar and glass, tucked so deeply into the pine-covered mountains that the rest of the world felt like a distant, frantic dream. But inside its walls, the air was thick with a tension that no amount of mountain breeze could clear. By his mother's decree, a command backed by the threat of a full family coup, Seong-gon had been stripped of his penthouse and his high-rise office. If he wanted to protect the future he had nearly erased, he had to exist within the same four walls as the woman he had broken. Living with Fatima was not the dramatic reconciliation Seong-gon had envisioned in his guilt-ridden fever dreams. There were no shouting matches, no tears, and no opportunities for him to buy his way back into her good graces. Instead, there was a silence so profound it made the dragon tattoos on his skin feel like they were vibrating with restless energy. Fatima moved through the house like a dignified shadow. She wore soft, oversized knits provided by Madame Kong, her long dark hair often braided back, revealing a face that had grown sharper, more maternal, and utterly unreachable. Whenever Seong-gon entered a room, she didn't flinch or flee. She simply finished what she was doing, sipping her herbal tea, reading a book on child development, or staring out at the mist-covered valley, and walked past him as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture she had outgrown. He was a king in an empty castle, and she was the architect of his isolation. Fatima, he had tried to say on the third night, catching her in the kitchen as she reached for a glass of water. His voice, usually a weapon of command, sounded hollow and desperate to his own ears. The reports. I know now. Shin manipulated the data. I know you never betrayed me. Fatima didn't stop. She didn't even turn her head. She poured the water, her movements fluid and calm, and only when the glass was full did she speak. Knowing the truth doesn't change the fact that you were willing to believe the lie, she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was indifferent. You didn't need a report to tell you who I was, Seong-gon. You had 2 years of my life. You had my heart in your hands every night. And you still signed the papers. She walked away, the soft hem of her robe brushing against his expensive slacks, leaving him standing in the dark kitchen with the crushing weight of his own failure. The days settled into a torturous rhythm. Seong-gon attempted to assert his role as a protector by obsessing over the security perimeter, checking the cameras 10 times an hour, and vetting the medical staff his mother had hired. He wanted to show her he was the boss, the man who could keep her safe. But every time he caught her eye, he saw the same unspoken truth. The only person she ever needed protection from was him. He began to watch her from the shadows of the hallway. He watched her struggle to find a comfortable position on the sofa as her belly grew, her hand resting on the swell of his child. He saw the way she winced when the baby kicked too hard, and his instinct was to rush to her, to place his hand where the life was jumping, to share the burden. But he remained frozen in the doorway. He was the man who had ordered her erased. He had forfeited the right to touch the miracle he had tried to prevent. One afternoon, a heavy storm rolled over the mountains, the thunder echoing the violence of the night he had thrown her out. Seong-gon found her in the library, standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the lightning. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing shallow. He knew she hated storms. He remembered how she used to hide her face in his chest when the thunder shook the penthouse. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. Fatima, it's just a storm. You're safe here. She turned then, her eyes flashing with a cold, piercing light that rivaled the lightning outside. I am safe because of your mother, Seong-gon. I am safe because I disappeared into the cracks of a city where you couldn't find me. Don't mistake my presence in this house for forgiveness. I am here for the child. You are just the man who happens to share their blood. The rejection was a physical blow, more painful than any bullet he had ever taken in a back-alley skirmish. He realized then that his tattoos, his money, and his reputation meant less than nothing to her. To the world, he was the great boss of the Eun syndicate. To Fatima, He was a coward who had failed the most basic test of loyalty. He spent his nights in the room across the hall from hers, the door left slightly ajar so he could hear her breathing. He would sit on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, listening to the quiet sounds of the woman he loved moving through the space he had once shared with her in his mind. He was learning that the greatest punishment for a man of power wasn't death or the loss of his throne. It was being forced to live with the ghost of what he had destroyed, watching it breathe and walk and carry his future, while knowing he was no longer a part of the story. Under the same roof, they were miles apart. Seong-gon was finally protecting her, but as he watched her silhouette pass his door in the moonlight, he realized the terrifying truth. He had saved her life, but he had lost her soul. And in the silence of the mountain-safe house, the dragon of soul felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The morning mist clung to the Gapyeong Valley like a shroud, turning the glass walls of the safe house into milky, opaque barriers. Inside, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that seemed to count down the seconds of Seong-gon's penance. He had spent the last hour in the kitchen, a space that felt entirely foreign to a man who had spent his life being served. He was attempting to brew the specific ginger and lemon infusion Fatima had once mentioned helped with her nausea, his large, tattooed hands moving with a clumsy, agonizing care. Fatima entered the room just as the steam began to curl from the porcelain pot. She stopped, her hand resting instinctively on the doorframe. The soft morning light caught the deep mahogany of her skin and the weary, guarded expression in her eyes. The swell of her pregnancy was more pronounced today, a physical manifestation of the time he had lost and the future he had nearly sabotaged. "The nurses are in the West Wing," she said, her voice cool and distant. "You don't need to do that." "I wanted to," Seong-gon replied, not looking up. He concentrated on the thin stream of tea as he poured it. "The doctor said you weren't sleeping well. I thought this might help." He stepped toward her, holding the cup. For a moment, the air between them hummed with the memory of who they used to be, the boss and the maid, the lover and the beloved. But as he reached out, Fatima's foot caught on the edge of the plush rug. Her balance, compromised by the weight she carried, faltered. "Fatima." The cup shattered against the floor, forgotten, as Seong-gon lunged forward. His arms, corded with muscle and etched with the tails of dragons, caught her before she could hit the ground. He pulled her flush against his chest, his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. For the first time in 6 months, he was holding her. The scent of her, cocoa butter and rain, hit him like a physical blow, stripping away the armor he had worn since the night of the dismissal. "I have you," he whispered, his voice raw. "I have you." Fatima didn't pull away immediately. She was breathless, her hands clutching his forearms for stability. Her fingers pressed into the ink of the dragon on his wrist, a stark contrast of vulnerability and power. And then it happened. Between their pressed bodies, a sudden, sharp pressure thud against Seong-gon's abdomen. It was a rhythmic, insistent flutter, followed by a solid, unmistakable kick. Seong-gon froze. His entire world narrowed down to that singular point of contact. The legacy he had discussed in boardrooms, the heir his mother had protected, it was no longer an abstract concept or a black and white ultrasound image. It was a life. It was a person. It was a tiny, defiant soul reaching out from the darkness to strike the man who had tried to erase it. He looked down at Fatima, his eyes wide and fractured with a sudden, overwhelming realization. His hand, trembling in a way that would have terrified his enemies, moved instinctively toward her stomach. He hesitated, his palm hovering an inch from the fabric of her sweater, waiting for the rejection he knew he deserved. Fatima looked at him, her own eyes swimming with a complex tide of hurt and shared wonder. She didn't move his hand away. She didn't speak. She simply leaned back slightly, allowing him the space he didn't earn. When his palm finally made contact, the child kicked again, landing squarely in the center of the dragon's head tattooed on his hand. The great boss of the Eun syndicate broke. The coldness he had cultivated as a survival mechanism, the pride that had kept him from kneeling at her feet, and the arrogance that told him he could fix this with money and security, it all dissolved into ash. He sank to his knees right there on the kitchen floor, amidst the shards of the broken teacup and the spilled lemon water. He pressed his forehead against the swell of her belly, his shoulders shaking with a silent, racking grief. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words muffled by her clothes. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I chose the throne. I chose the shadows, and I almost killed the only light I ever had." Fatima stood still, her hand hovering over his dark, ruffled hair, but never quite touching it. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a reckoning. She looked down at the man who had once commanded her life with a single word, now reduced to a weeping shadow at her feet. "A kick doesn't fix a broken heart, Seong-gon," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the months she had spent in the dark. "It just reminds us what we're fighting for." He looked up at her, his face wet, his expression shattered, but finally, undeniably human. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he was miles away from deserving it. But as he stayed there on his knees, his hands still feeling the phantom vibration of his child's life, the dragon was gone. In his place was a man who realized that he had spent his whole life building an empire of glass, only to find that the only thing worth holding was the person he had almost let shatter. The resolve to be the boss was gone. He didn't want the syndicate. He didn't want the war. He wanted to be the man who earned the right to hold that hand without it trembling. He stayed on the floor long after she finally pulled away, the shattered porcelain around him a mirror of his own soul, broken, but finally seeing the light through the cracks. The tranquility of the Gapyeong retreat was a fragile illusion, shattered not by a bullet, but by the high-pitched, rhythmic clicking of designer heels against the hardwood foyer. Park Seo-hye arrived with the entitlement of a woman who had been promised a kingdom. As the daughter of a real estate titan and the woman the syndicate board had handpicked to be the next matriarch, she didn't knock. She invaded. Dressed in a cream-colored wool suit that cost more than Fatima's annual salary at the estate, Seo-hye marched into the conservatory. She had spent weeks simmering in the humiliation of Seong-gon's sudden disappearance from the Seoul social circuit, fueled by whispers of a private medical matter at his mother's mountain villa. But as she rounded the corner and saw Fatima sitting by the fire, the truth hit her with the force of a physical slap. Fatima didn't stand. She didn't have to. The quiet, heavy dignity of her pregnancy filled the room, making Seo-hye's frantic elegance look thin and desperate. "So," Seo-hye said, her voice a sharp, manicured blade. "This is the security risk Seong-gon was so desperate to erase. I expected a spy, or perhaps a rival's daughter, not the girl who used to polish my fiancé's shoes." Fatima looked up from her book, her expression calm, though her hand tightened instinctively over her stomach. "He isn't your fiancé, Seo-hye. He's a man who made a deal with your father. There's a difference." Seo-hye's face contorted, the mask of high society poise slipping to reveal a predatory ugliness beneath. She stepped closer, her perfume cloying and aggressive in the mountain air. "You think that because you've trapped him with a biological fluke, you've won? You're a footnote, Fatima. A mistake written in a maid's uniform. Seong-gon is a creature of status, and you are a stain on his ledger." "If I am a stain," Fatima said, her voice dropping to that low, vibrating register that had once commanded Seong-gon's respect, "then why are you here? Why are your hands shaking?" The hit landed. Seo-hye's fingers curled into claws around her alligator skin clutch. She knew the syndicate's laws. If this child was recognized, her strategic marriage was a hollow contract. She would be the woman who was passed over for a servant, a humiliation that would echo through the boardrooms of Seoul for a generation. "I am here to finish what Seong-gon was too weak to complete," Seo-hye hissed. She leaned down, her face inches from Fatima's. "Money can make people vanish, but scandal can make them die. I've already spoken to the Immigration Bureau. Your special visa status? It's being reviewed. And the medical staff here? They work for the Eun family, but their licenses are managed by my father's foundations." She reached out, her long, sharp fingernails hovering inches from Fatima's face. I will give you 1 hour to take the payout I've left in the foyer and disappear. If you are still here when the sun sets, I will ensure that the medical emergency this child represents is handled with surgical finality. Seong-gon won't stop me. He's already proven he doesn't want you. That's where you're wrong. The voice came from the shadows of the arched doorway, low and lethal. Seong-gon stepped into the light, his black shirt unbuttoned, the dragon on his neck looking as if it were ready to breathe fire. He didn't look like the polished CEO Seo-hai had been courting. He looked like the Mafia boss who had earned his throne in the trenches of the underworld. Seo-hai spun around, her face instantly shifting back into a practiced, sugary pout. Seong-gon, darling, I was just telling this girl how much better it would be for everyone if... Seong-gon didn't let her finish. He moved with a speed that made the room feel small, crossing the floor until he stood directly between the two women. He didn't look at Seo-hai. His eyes were fixed on Fatima, checking for the slightest sign of distress. When he saw the flash of hurt in Fatima's eyes, the last of his restraint snapped. You entered my mother's house without an invitation, Seong-gon said, his voice a terrifying, quiet growl. You threatened the mother of my child. And you spoke of erasure in a room where I am currently begging for the right to exist. Seong-gon, be reasonable. Seo-hai cried, her voice rising in panic. The board will never accept this. Your father's legacy. My father is dead. Seong-gon cut her off, turning his gaze toward her for the first time. The ice in his eyes made Seo-hai stumble back. And the legacy I am building starts with the life in this room. You want to talk about immigration? I own the officials you tried to bribe. You want to talk about medical licenses? I will burn your father's foundations to the ground before I let a single one of your people near her. He stepped closer, his muscular frame looming over her. Get out of this house. If I see your car on this mountain in 10 minutes, I won't call your father. I'll call my enforcers. And they don't care about social standing. Seo-hai's mouth opened and closed, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. She looked at the dragon-tattooed man she thought she could control, and then at the pregnant woman he was shielding with his own body. She realized then that the strategic alliance was dead. Seong-gon wasn't just defending a maid. He was declaring war on the world that demanded he be heartless. She turned and fled, the sound of her heels echoing like a dying pulse as she ran toward the door. The silence that followed was heavy. Seong-gon stayed where he was, his back to Fatima, his shoulders heaving. He felt a hand touch his arm, a light, tentative pressure that made his breath hitch. He turned, finding Fatima looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't the cold indifference of the previous weeks either. She won't come back, he whispered, his hand covering hers on his arm. I won't let anyone touch you again, not even the world I built. Fatima looked at the door, then back at him. You just made an enemy of the most powerful families in the city, Seong-gon. You destroyed your alliance for a woman you called a liability. I destroyed a prison, he corrected, his voice raw. I finally realized that I'd rather be a man standing alone with you than a king sitting on a throne built of people I've erased. He didn't try to pull her into his arms. He knew the bridge was still under construction, brick by painful brick. But as they stood together in the fading mountain light, the poisoned air of the betrothal had cleared, replaced by the scent of pine and the terrifying, beautiful reality of a man who had finally chosen a side. The war was coming, he knew that. But as he looked at Fatima, he realized he wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life, he had something worth losing. The mountain air, usually crisp and silent, suddenly curdled with the mechanical whine of engines cutting through the pine thickets. Seong-gon felt the shift in the atmosphere before the first perimeter alarm even tripped. It was a predator's instinct, honed by a decade of surviving coups and street wars. He didn't reach for a phone to call the authorities. He reached for the tactical holster hidden beneath his silk shirt and moved toward the nursery wing. Director Shin had finally played his last hand. Knowing the high society betrothal had collapsed and that Seong-gon was choosing a maid over the syndicate's established order, the rival factions had realized they couldn't wait for a slow corporate takeover. They had sent the wolves to the mountain to ensure the Eun bloodline ended before it truly began. Fatima, get to the reinforced suite. Now, Seong-gon's voice wasn't a request. It was a roar of command that brooked no argument. Fatima appeared at the end of the hallway, her face pale, but her eyes remarkably steady. She didn't scream. She had seen the dragon in him before, but never like this, never focused entirely on her survival. She clutched her stomach, moving with a grounded, heavy grace toward the inner sanctum of the villa as the first window shattered in the foyer downstairs. The sound of gunfire erupted, sharp and rhythmic, echoing against the cedar beams of the house. Seong-gon's private security, the few men he still trusted, were engaging the intruders on the lawn, but the heavy thud of boots on the veranda told him the perimeter had been breached. Seong-gon stood at the threshold of the nursery door, his muscular frame silhouetted against the soft, pastel-colored wallpaper and the empty crib that waited for his child. He looked at the dragon tattoos on his hands, then gripped his weapon. For years, these hands had taken territory, enforced debts, and built a throne of fear. Tonight, for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for a percentage of the soul docs or a seat at the board table. He was fighting for a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. The door at the end of the hall splintered inward. 3 men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, charged through the dust. They weren't there to kidnap. They moved with the lethal intent of assassins. Seong-gon didn't hesitate. He became a blur of ink and violence. He didn't fight with the cold calculation of a businessman anymore. He fought with the primal ferocity of a father. He took a bullet to the shoulder, the white silk of his shirt blooming with a sudden, angry red, but he didn't even flinch. He stayed planted in front of that door, a human shield made of scar tissue and regret. "You want the air?" Seong-gon hissed, his voice sounding like grinding stones as he disarmed the first man with a sickening crack of bone. "You have to go through the king." He used the narrow hallway to his advantage, turning the luxury home into a kill zone. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision, using his knowledge of the house's blind spots to pick them apart. Every time a stray bullet nicked the doorframe of the nursery, Seong-gon's rage hit a new, more lethal gear. He was a man who had erased his own soul once. He had nothing left to fear from death. Inside the reinforced suite, Fatima pressed her back against the cold steel of the door. She could hear the muffled thuds of bodies hitting the floor, the guttural shouts of men, and the terrifyingly consistent sound of Seong-gon's breathing, heavy, ragged, but unbroken. She realized then that the man outside wasn't the boss she had hated for the last 6 months. The man outside was the one who had knelt in the spilled tea and wept. He was paying his debt in blood, 1 inch of hallway at a time. The final assassin, a man Seong-gon recognized as one of Director Shin's personal enforcers, managed to pin Seong-gon against the wall. The assassin's knife grazed Seong-gon's ribs, slicing through a dragon's wing on his chest. "The board sends its regards, Seong-gon," the man sneered, pressing the blade closer to his throat. A Maid's bastard was never going to sit on the throne. Seong-gon's eyes flashed with a light that was almost blinding. He didn't move away from the blade. He leaned into it. "It's not a throne," Seong-gon gasped, his hand snapping out to catch the man's throat with a grip like a vice. "It's a family." With a final, desperate surge of strength, Seong-gon drove the man back through the shattered glass of the balcony. They tumbled together, but Seong-gon caught the railing, watching the assassin disappear into the dark ravine below. Silence returned to the mountain, heavy and suffocating. Seong-gon leaned against the nursery door, his shirt soaked in red, his breath coming in shallow, whistling gasps. He was trembling, not from the pain, but from the adrenaline of a man who had just looked into the abyss and refused to blink. He reached back and knocked twice on the reinforced wood. "Fatima," he choked out. "It's over. They're gone." The door clicked open. Fatima stepped out, her eyes wide as she took in the carnage of the hallway and the state of the man standing before her. She saw the blood dripping from his hand, hitting the floor right next to the spot where he had knelt days before. She didn't stay back. She moved toward him, her hands reaching out to steady his swaying frame. For the first time, she didn't see the tattoos or the Mafia boss. She saw a man who had nearly died to keep a promise he hadn't even made out loud yet. "You're hurt." she whispered, her voice breaking. Seong-gon looked at her, then down at the hand she was holding, the hand the baby had kicked. He managed a weak, shattered smile. I told you. I wouldn't let them touch you. I'm a man of my word, Fatima, even if it took me too long to remember it. He collapsed then, his weight falling into her, and for the first time since the night in the rain, Fatima didn't pull away. She held him on the floor of the nursery wing, her tears falling onto his blood-stained shirt. The siege was over, but as the sirens of his mother's backup units finally began to wail in the distance, Seong-gon realized he had won something far more valuable than a battle. He had defended the door, and in the eyes of the woman holding him, he saw, for the first time, the faint, flickering ghost of a second chance. The glass and steel monolith of the Eun Syndicate headquarters towered over Seoul like a silent, watchful god. But inside the top-floor boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of impending regicide. The air conditioning hummed at a clinical temperature, yet the 12 men seated around the obsidian table were sweating. Director Shin sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, already wearing the invisible crown of a man who believed his rival was bleeding out on a mountainside in Gapyeong. The silence from the mountain is deafening, Shin remarked, his voice smooth and cold. We must move to appoint an interim chairman. Seong-gon's recent instabilities have made him a liability to our bottom line. The Eun bloodline is a dying flame. The heavy double doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown back with a violence that made the crystal water carafes on the table rattle. Eun Seong-gon walked into the room. He was not the polished, suit-clad executive they were used to seeing. His arm was in a black silk sling, and a stark white bandage peeked out from the collar of his shirt, stark against the dark ink of the dragon on his neck. His face was a mask of bruised marble, his eyes burning with a lethal, predatory clarity that made half the board members instinctively push their chairs back. But it was the woman at his side who turned the room into a vacuum. Fatima walked with her head held high, her hand resting on the crook of Seong-gon's good arm. She was dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk provided by Madame Kong, a color that glowed against her rich, dark skin. She was no longer the girl in the charcoal maid's uniform. She was a queen consort entering a den of wolves. The visible swell of her pregnancy was a silent, thunderous declaration that the dying flame Shin had spoken of was, in fact, a rising sun. I believe I heard the word liability as I entered, Seong-gon said, his voice dropping into the room like a heavy stone into a deep well. He didn't go to his chair. He walked the length of the table, forcing every man to track his movement, until he stood directly behind Director Shin. Shin's face had turned the color of ash. Seong-gon, we heard. There was an incident. We were concerned for your safety. You were concerned with my burial, Seong-gon corrected, his hand, the one etched with the dragon's head, landing heavily on Shin's shoulder. He squeezed, his knuckles whitening, and the director let out a choked gasp of pain. But as you can see, I am quite alive. And I didn't come alone. Seong-gon turned toward Fatima, his expression softening for a fraction of a second in a way that terrified the board more than his rage ever could. A man with a weakness is a target. A man with a purpose is a god. For months, this board has whispered about my legacy, Seong-gon announced, his voice projecting to every corner of the room. You listened to fabricated reports. You conspired to erase a woman because she didn't fit your spreadsheets of purity and status. You tried to kill my future before it took its first breath. He moved to the center of the room, standing beside Fatima. He placed his hand over hers, right where the child moved beneath the emerald silk. This is Fatima Sekinat Isreal, he said, and for the first time, he spoke her name in this room not as a servant, but as a title. She is not a distraction. She is not a maid. She is the mother of the next boss of the Eun Syndicate. And anyone who looks at her and sees anything less than the future of this empire will find themselves erased with the same cold efficiency you once recommended for her. The room was so silent the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a sledgehammer. Director Shin tried to find his voice, his eyes darting to the other board members for support, but he found only averted gazes. The men at the table were sharks. They could smell when the tide had turned. They saw the blood on Seong-gon's bandage and the iron in Fatima's eyes, and they realized that the maid they had mocked was now the most protected person in South Korea. The reports were forged, Shin. Seong-gon continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper as he leaned over the table. I have the logs. I have the digital footprints. I have the names of the men you sent to the mountain. My mother is currently turning that evidence over to the prosecutors, but I thought I'd come here first, to give you the courtesy of a face-to-face dismissal. Seong-gon reached out and tore the corporate pin from Shin's lapel, the silver breaking with a sharp snap. Get out, Seong-gon commanded, before I decide that a legal reckoning is too merciful for a man who targeted a nursery. Shin scrambled from his seat, his dignity disintegrating as he fled the room, followed by the 3 board members who had been his loudest supporters. The remaining men sat frozen, looking at the tattooed man and the pregnant woman who had just redefined the rules of the underworld. Fatima stood steady throughout it all. She didn't look at the men with fear, nor with a desire for revenge. She looked at them with the weary, profound wisdom of a woman who had survived the worst they had to offer and come out the other side holding the prize. Seong-gon turned to her, the silence of the room finally settling into something respectful, even fearful. He didn't ask the board for their approval. He didn't ask for a vote. He simply took Fatima's hand and kissed it, right there in front of the most powerful men in the city. The meeting is adjourned, Seong-gon said, his eyes never leaving hers. The Eun family has private matters to attend to. As they walked out of the boardroom, the glass doors swinging shut behind them, the weight of the syndicate felt lighter on Seong-gon's shoulders. He had walked into that room to save his throne, but as he looked at the woman beside him, he realized he had done something much bigger. He had stopped being a boss and started being a father. The public reckoning was over, and the world now knew that the Dragon of Soul had a heart, and that heart was beating in rhythm with the woman he had once tried to erase. The first snowfall of the season descended upon Seoul like a benediction, dusting the sharp edges of the Eun estate in a layer of pristine, silent white. Inside the master suite, the air was warm, smelling of sterilized linen and the faint, sweet scent of almond oil. The high-tech medical monitors that had once cluttered the room had been moved to the periphery, their rhythmic chirping replaced by a sound that made the great dragon of the Eun syndicate feel more vulnerable than any blade ever could. The soft, snuffing breath of a sleeping infant. Eun Seong-gon sat on the edge of the expansive bed, his large frame hunched over a small, silk-lined bassinet. He was still dressed in his black suit trousers, but his shirt was discarded, his chest bare to reveal the intricate dragon tattoos that spanned his muscular torso. Across his ribs and shoulder, the pale, jagged scars from the mountain siege remained, permanent reminders of the price he had paid to reach this moment. He didn't look like a man who controlled the shipping lanes of the peninsula. He looked like a man who was afraid to breathe too loudly. Fatima lay propped up against the pillows, her dark hair fanned out like a silken halo. The exhaustion of a 30-hour labor still clung to the corners of her eyes, but the ice that had guarded her expression for months had finally melted into a look of profound, weary peace. She watched Seong-gon, her hand resting on the spot where he had knelt so many weeks ago. "He has your nose," she whispered, her voice a soft rasp in the quiet room. "But he has my stubbornness. He refused to come out until he was ready." Seong-gon didn't look up. His eyes were locked on the tiny, mahogany-skinned hand that had curled instinctively around his thumb. The contrast was startling. The massive, tattooed hand of a killer held captive by 5 perfect, miniature fingers. "I spent my whole life thinking power was a tally," Seong-gon said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I thought it was the number of men who bowed when I walked in. I thought it was the billions in the ledger and the fear I could see in a rival's eyes. I thought that if the world feared me, I was safe." He carefully lifted his thumb, watching as the baby, Eun Malik Songho, let out a tiny, discontented mewl before settling back into a deep sleep. "I was wrong," Seong-gon continued, finally looking up at Fatima. His sharp features, once so terrifying to the boardrooms of Seoul, were softened by a raw, naked sincerity. Real power isn't the ability to erase someone, Fatima. It's the ability to be the person they want to come home to. It's the weight of this child in my arms and the fact that you are still breathing the same air as me after everything I did to destroy us. Fatima reached out, her fingers brushing against the dragon tattoo on his forearm. The dragon was a mask, Seong-gon. You used it to hide the man who was afraid of being loved because love is the only thing you can't control with a contract or a gun. I don't want to control it anymore, he confessed, leaning forward to press his forehead against hers. I just want to be worthy of it. The door to the suite pushed open quietly, and Madame Kong stepped in, her silk robes whispering against the floor. She carried a tray of traditional seaweed soup, but she stopped the moment she saw her son. She had seen him win wars and crush rebellions, but she had never seen him look as powerful as he did in that moment, sitting in the soft light of the nursery lamp, guarded by nothing but the love of the woman he had once discarded. The board is calling, Seong-gon, the matriarch said, though her smile was soft. They want to know the name of the heir. They want to know when the dragon will return to the office. Seong-gon looked at the bassinet, then at Fatima, and finally at his mother. He felt the phantom ache of his scars, the weight of his history, and the incredible, light-filled potential of the future. Tell them the boss is occupied, Seong-gon said, his voice steady and full of a new kind of authority, one that didn't require a raised voice or a threat. Tell them the dragon is busy learning how to be a father. The empire can wait. My family cannot. Madame Kong nodded, her eyes shimmering with a pride she had waited 30 years to feel. She left them alone in the quiet, golden warmth of the room. Seong-gon stood and walked to the window, watching the snow fall over the city he had conquered. Below, the lights of Seoul flickered like a million distant stars, but they no longer felt like a prize to be won. He turned back to the bed, watching Fatima drift into a peaceful sleep beside their son. He realized then that he had spent his life building a fortress of glass and steel, thinking he was protecting a legacy. But as he crawled into bed beside the woman who had survived his worst and seen his best, pulling the quilt over the three of them, he knew the truth. His true empire wasn't the skyscrapers or the syndicates. It was the rhythmic breathing of the people in this room. The great boss of Seoul closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't dream of war. He dreamed of the first time he would teach his son to walk, of the apology he would spend the rest of his life living out for Fatima, and of a world where a name was something you cherished, not something you erased. The dragon had finally found his home, and in the silence of the winter night, the king realized that he was finally, truly, free. The transformation of Eun Seong-gon from a ruthless shadow king to a protective father serves as a visceral masterclass in the true nature of power. For years, Seong-gon operated under the pervasive delusion that authority is synonymous with isolation, that to lead, one must erase any person or emotion that creates a vulnerability. He viewed his empire as a cold machine, where people were merely parts to be serviced or discarded. Yet, the narrative arc of his downfall and eventual resurrection proves that a throne built on the absence of love is not a fortress, it is a cage. The moral at the heart of this high-stakes thriller is that legacy is not a business metric. Seong-gon nearly sacrificed his own bloodline because he mistook a strategic alliance for security and a loyal heart for a liability. It was only through the crushing weight of his own mistake that he learned the story's most enduring lesson. Real power is not found in being feared by the world, but in being indispensable to the people who truly know you. Fatima's journey provides the emotional anchor for this educational angle, demonstrating that dignity is an internal fortress. Despite being stripped of her status and cast into the rain, she remained the most powerful person in the narrative because her worth was never tied to the Eun name. She proved that resilience is the ultimate countermeasure to tyranny. Her refusal to immediately forgive Seong-gon, forcing him to bleed and battle for his place in her life, teaches us that restoration requires more than an apology. It requires a complete dismantling of the ego. As the snow blankets the Eun estate, the story leaves us with a final, grounding truth. An empire without an ethical heart is a hollow house of cards. Seong-gon had to stop being a boss to become a man. He had to realize that the dragon on his skin was just ink, but the heartbeat of his son was the only real immortality he would ever achieve. In the end, the story of the erased Maid and the Mafia king is a reminder that the most significant battles aren't fought in boardrooms or back alleys, but in the quiet spaces where we decide who we are willing to protect, who we are willing to change for, and what, or who, we are finally unwilling to lose.